Hi, everyone, and welcome to Our Small Majority. I'm your host, Christian Black.
And I'm your co-host, Matthew Gorichkovsky. Today we have our first official guest on Our Small Majority. He's an educator, an activist, and the director of partnerships and professional learning at an amazing organization called Overcoming Racism. Thank you for joining us today, Ahmed.
Excited to be here.
All right. We are so excited to talk to you today. We have a lot of questions about overcoming racism and just about your own personal experience too and how you got involved into that. So we want to thank you again for coming on to our show.
Of course, it's a pleasure.
Before we dive into overcoming racism, we wanted to learn a little bit about you and why you decided to join Overcoming Racism. What brought you in your life to this organization and to teach anti-racism in education?
I think it's kind of unavoidable. So my background's in education, and if I go all the way back, I was, fell into the typical immigrant trope of, everyone's got to be either a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer. So I
Mhm.
went to undergrad, specifically doing biology, pre med. Wanted to do the whole medical school thing, and ended up being a teacher in Atlanta, Georgia. And I think education is a very unique field, and then it really just kind of pulls back the covers on what society is and what it's not. I was teaching on the west side of Atlanta, at an entirely black middle school in a neighborhood that has been robbed of opportunity in so many ways, and doing the work of being a teacher in that context. And you learn a lot about who society really cares about. And I think systemic oppression and racism rears its ugly head in the most obvious and offensive ways in that context. I think myself and even Matthew, the founder and CEO of Overcome Racism, we'd always say that, like, we didn't opt into doing this work, but it felt almost obligatory at some point in time, where it's hard to avoid it. And when you see a problem, you have two options, honestly, when it reaches your consciousness. You either ignore it or you do something about it. And that's really kind of where it started. So I went on. My career as an educator, doing teacher coaching and development, specifically thinking through this lens of racial identity and how that informs the way that we develop, support, train teachers, and what they're able to actualize and work for in schools. Most recently, was a school leader in Brooklyn, New York. Love the work of education, love the work of working with young people. And, the founder CEO of Overcoming Racism, I've known since we were undergraduate students. And, when he founded the organization a few years back, we always kind of, worked on parallel trajectories, so to speak. When the time seemed right, that's when I joined the team full time.
It kind of feels. I mean, I kind of resonate in a way with that, where it's like once you start learning about like all the awful things in like that's going on in America and all the hidden things. And like I studied education sciences when I was in college.
Right.
So like it was going into it, at first I thought I was going to be learning specifically about like how to be a teacher and all of that. My very first class that I took was about like how awful the US education system is and how it's going downhill. And I
Yeah.
still have that, my very first book from that class, and all it is about is like how the US is falling behind. And
Yeah.
that's what got me interested in now. Like this, this podcast kind of comes from that, where it's like it's just impossible to ignore once you learn about it.
Yeah, I bet that professor also had a hard time like keeping that syllabus updated. You know what I mean? Like,
Probably,
adding
yeah.
it's like wake up on a Tuesday. It's like, oh man, I gotta add that to the syllabus. Like, you have more and more that pop up.
Yeah, no, exactly. Oh, especially now with like Betsy DeVos and stuff.
Oh man, don't get me
Oh
started.
man.
Yeah, she's kind of supporting this withhold funding movement that's happening right now, which is
Hmm.
yeah.
It's
Mhm.
it's awful. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you said you're in DC now. I know Matthew uh started overcoming racism in New Orleans, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So
Mhm.
do you travel between there and New Orleans?
So it's interesting because overcoming racism was founded in New Orleans, and that's where Matthew is based at, and that's really where a
Hmm.
lot of the work started. Just like working with schools. When he transitioned out of the school system, he was working with
Mhm.
the school that he worked at, and then other ones. specifically around this. And in the years since, it's expanded. And I mean, our work is not not even predominantly in New Orleans. We operate around, man, close to
Hmm.
30 states at this point.
Wow.
We do some
Wow.
international work as well. So, I mean, I always joke that I was living in Brooklyn when and running a school when I joined the team full time. And, once I like took that job and made that shift, I decided to relocate to DC, which is where I grew up. And, I probably moved in like July. And, between July and February, right? Like when we get to coronavirus, nobody go anywhere.
Hmm.
um, in that span of time, I probably spent a total of like a month in DC. So we're like always on the move, particularly in summers, and just in a new city, engaging with new partners. And I think it's really informed a lot of the landscape in
Hmm.
which we do this work, right? Like we're not just talking about systemic racism and how it presents in
Hmm.
New Orleans, Louisiana, right, which has like a unique tradition, history, and culture, and that means something different. We see what it looks like in Los Angeles, in Oakland, in Houston, in Chicago, in DC, in New York, in Massachusetts. All of those things vary. Oh, phone call.
No worries. Do you need to take it right now?
Yeah, you know, it's like a hotel room
Yeah,
phone
no
call.
worries.
Hey, there was like AirPods in there a little bit. Okay, great. I'll come around. All right, we're good. The valet guy was like asking a random question. Like, that's thing.
Yeah,
The
no
concept
worries.
of like having an unmutable phone is so weird and new to me.
There's a such thing. Wait, you're
Yeah.
why
Well, I mean,
why
I
is
don't know
it?
how to like. How do you make a hotel room not ring? Hotel phone not
Oh,
ring.
unhook
Oh.
it. Just
See, that's what I'm saying. It's like a weird concept. I'm like looking at this thing, like, how do I get you to not ring?
Right.
All right, I'm good to go.
yeah, no worries. So,
Nice. Not a problem.
uh, could you give? I know we're talking about overcoming racism because, like, we know of it, but could you give like a quick description of it for the audience so they have an understanding of what exactly overcoming racism is and what
Oh
you do
man.
there?
Yeah, that's a complicated question, but also like a really simple one. Specifically, as an organization, we facilitate workshops, professional development, engagements, and consultation, specifically around teaching people what it means to be anti-racist, and how anti-racism is a very active process, and an active process that doesn't just challenge the hearts and minds of people and how they see things and what they believe to be true, but really challenges how institutions operate at a policy level. So that's the
Hmm.
work that we do. We deliver direct in-service workshops, which is literally like we teach people about this topic, and help them figure out what it means to try to path forward for their organization. And we do consulting work, executive coaching work, helping organizations get a snapshot of what the state of equity is. And really, honestly, like the big thing we always say is that justice must come before comfort, and
Hmm.
and that's kind of
Hmm.
what informs how we interact with our partners.
Wow.
So I guess you mentioned anti-racism. So I think that my next question would be what exactly is anti-racism?
Yeah, so I mean, we have a reality of systemic racism globally, but definitely specifically to the context of the United States of America. It's informed the institutions and how they operate, from healthcare to politics to finance, wealth distribution, all of those, housing. All these institutions are grounded in these foundational ideas, and these foundational policies that breed disparities along the line of race. So, anti-racism is about the active process of disrupting and dismantling those structures so that they don't perpetuate disparities moving forward. So it's not enough
Hmm.
to be not racist. That implicates neutrality, right? Like there's no neutrality in this work. So if you don't do anything, then you are passively participating in the disparities that exist along the line of race. So anti-racism is about moving from that neutrality, or the moving walkway, as Dr. Beverly Tatum would call it, and really think about what the active process of deconstructing those systems are.
Hmm.
Hmm. Well, I think one of my questions would be for you is going off of that and looking into policy compared to where you are right now, DC and New Orleans. If you were to compare the two when it comes to the policies that causes those sort of shifts or those sort of disparities for the Black and Brown communities in both areas for DC and for New Orleans, what would you say is sort of the key differences between the two? Because I myself, I have a lot of experience inside the deep South, so New Orleans, Mobile, Alabama, Texas, Austin, Texas, because of a lot of my family resides there. And if you look at certain demographics in certain areas between the South or like here in the West in California or over there on the East Coast in Washington, you'll see different policies. So, what is your take on that, and what have you experienced?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is that there's probably more overlap than there are differences, right? And that's the thing about systemic racism. It's pretty consistent, right? It's, you know, I
Hmm.
mean, like no
Hmm.
matter where you go, it kind of has like the same effects, but operates in slightly different ways. I mean, both of those locations were, uh, predominantly majority black cities. New Orleans is still a majority black city, so it's always interesting when I go there and people talk about like minority populations, and they're like think they're talking about black people, and I'm like, oh no, black people are the majority here. Hold on, let's get the
Hmm.
facts right.
Hmm. Hmm.
DC dipped slightly below being majority at like 46%. But we end up seeing the same widespread impact of gentrification of the literally the present day ramifications of redlining. When it took place in the 1930s in the Federal Housing Administration, we see those
Hmm.
taking place. But I think what might be a little bit different in DC in particular is that DC has a whole separate fight that it's doing in terms of getting access to rights as a state, right? Like the DC statehood movement is a big thing as well.
Hmm.
So you end up having this kind of this lack of a voice in federal government for residents of the District of Columbia, which historically has been a predominantly black city and still sees massive disparities with like entire neighborhoods that will be all white now, where they were like previously all black. Or what
Hmm.
we'll see that east of the river, there's literally like a river that kind of cuts through Washington D.C. But if you like cross a bridge and you're in D.C. east of the river, you get to like an almost entirely black part of the city, and they'll have like inequitable access to even hospitals, right? Like people will literally have to like travel 40 minutes in order to give birth, right? Like for that to take place for mothers. Disproportionate spending on police, we see a lot of leeching in terms of like federal government and federal policies and that kind of tension, which makes it slightly different than New Orleans. But by and large, the problems are pretty universal, and when you go across the country, you see the same thing. You see the
Hmm.
same
Hmm.
issues in political representation, you see the same issues in housing discrimination, you see the same issues in access to healthcare. See the same wealth gaps that exist in those areas as well.
And that kind of dives into equality versus equity, right?
Right.
That whole argument that's going on, or that conversation. Really, it shouldn't even be an
Yeah.
argument now.
I mean, I would even say like the clarification, right? You know,
Yeah.
we do this weird thing where people just like define words incorrectly for so long that we will dive on the sword for that definition, and we'll like that will be the hill that we claim.
Hmm.
It happens a lot. Like, and I'm one who's like real particular about words, so I was always the person who, when people would say like, oh man, I feel nauseous, I would always like kind of cringe a little bit because I was like, ooh, you don't mean that, right? Like, you mean you're nauseated, but like you don't want to ever
Okay.
be that guy, right? So I
Hmm.
just don't say anything. And then what happens? The dictionary evolves, and the dictionary like then has alternate definitions of nauseous that like then coincide with nauseated. So
Hmm.
like I can't even say anything. People use the word peruse wrong all the time, which is my favorite. Someone's like, oh, I'm gonna peruse these magazines real quick, and I'm like, yeah, nah, peruse means
What
like,
is what is yeah? What does it mean?
yeah. So all right, so take a stab at it. What's your like working definition of peruse? No
Peruse?
judgment.
I don't
You
think
might
I've
just get
ever heard
outed
the
on this
word.
podcast.
This is the first time I've heard this word. I think
Oh, peruse?
peruse.
No? Okay, Christian, how about
I
you?
Yeah.
I've never used that inside of my vocabulary. I would just be all like, I'd just be like,
It is
"Oh, I'm gonna
me.
browse this magazine, or I'm gonna look at it, or I'm
There
just
you
gonna see
go.
what the fuss is about." So,
But most of the time people use it to mean browse, right? Like you're kind
Oh,
hmm.
of,
okay.
superficially passing by, looking, glancing at things, right?
Hmm.
Peruse actually means the exact opposite. It means to look at something very like deeply and intently in like a
Intently.
focused manner. Yeah. So like when you go to a bookstore, like you're not perusing, you're like doing the exact opposite, right? But we
Mm.
just use it so wrong all the time. That it just becomes its functional definition. And if language is malleable, right? Like, so language evolves and adapts, but it's always good to have that conversation. Like equity and equality are very different, because when you're talking about equality, you're talking about like what you're giving people, and you're giving them the same thing. It's about the
Hmm.
action and not the outcome. When you're talking about equity, you're talking about the destination that you get to. I don't care what you have to give people, right, to get them to the destination they need to get to. I just care that they get to that destination. And that's
Hmm.
like what an equity orientation is.
Mhm.
Equality is like, oh yeah, I'm just gonna give all y'all the same thing. So it's an important differentiation. And like, though that language and that terminology and the way that we speak of these things, it matters and it's significant. um even down to like how people define racism. And one of my favorite things that's happened in the past couple weeks is, like Merriam-Webster has evolved their definition of racism, and not even evolved it, but like have opted in order to have the definition they put in their dictionary to be an accurate representation of what scholars in that field have been, defining racism as for, years, decades at this point.
Mhm.
So I mean, we just see this like really, really important need for common language in the way that we talk about and discuss these things.
Hmm.
Because in the absence of that, people are left to just operate based on what they believe to be true or their socialization, and you already know that can get real messy.
Yeah.
Right.
So how do we make the United States an equitable society and our education in the United States?
I mean, that's a big question.
Yeah.
Y'all got a couple weeks to talk about it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
let's
I mean,
go.
honestly, yeah, we gotta start. So I'm gonna connect it to something that Angela Davis said recently. She recently had an interview where people were asking her about this, like, the protests have been taking place and the civil unrest and the defund the police
Mhm.
movement, and she literally said that it's an exciting time. That's the word that she used. She said it's an
Hmm.
exciting
Oh,
time,
yeah.
and I'm paraphrasing, but like, beyond the word exciting, the idea she was communicating is that people are starting to challenge and critique the fundamental assumptions that we make about what a thing is and what a thing should be, right? Like, we're
Mhm.
throwing away the conventional ideas of what it's always been in order to dream a little bit more. So if you really want to like push this country in the direction of equity, we got to really, critique and interrogate everything, right?
Mhm.
Things that might just seem too big or too standard or too common for us to even change or do anything about. We have to question them and really just think about, how do we envision a completely different reality. Like, we're doing
Mhm.
that right now in a lot of ways, not by choice, right? Like, we're re-envisioning work right now. The whole concept of like, wake up in the morning, get dressed, and go to a physical location in order to work, we're
Hmm.
questioning that. Like, why does that have to be the case in the era of technology and, these like laptops and cameras and microphones and wireless internet? Like, what is the actual benefit? And then you get the studies around like the productivity and how people are more productive at home, and like all of these things are, do we need a 7-day work week, right? Do we need a 5-day work week? Like, all of these things are being challenged at their root, and we need to do that with American society and how we're structured. We need to ask ourselves, like, let's think about how we're taxed. Let's think about how the Constitution is structured. Let's think about what amendments we have in place. Let's think about how politics works, how people get elected into office, how funds are
Mhm.
redistributed. How do we maintain law and order? How do we think about healthcare, right? Like, let's just
Hmm.
pretend that we don't have the baggage associated with how the world is right now. And we just
Mhm.
start from scratch. We're trying to create a society that works for everybody. How do we do that? And, what we've realized in the work that we do is that oftentimes having the answers to those questions isn't the issue. It's being bold enough to actually ask them and to actually like take a stab at answering them. We always tell institutions, we're like, whatever problems you're dealing with, the answers and the solutions exist within your organization right now. Right now. If you wanted to
Mhm.
stop, pause, turn around, and ask the right question, you would likely get to a destination. But we just often either don't know what question needs to be asked because, like, we're stuck in the way things have always been,
Mhm.
or we're afraid of the consequences of it, particularly if we're benefiting from the system as it exists right now.
Right.
Hmm.
Well, stemming off of that, one question that I have in particular to public education in the United States, because now since COVID-19 broke out, people are starting to question, well, is school even necessary for attendance since everything is virtual, everything is remote, and we're really questioning um not only should kids go back to school, but also what are they learning in school to begin with? And that's an argument that's always been thrown around in a conversation that's been brought up from time and time again throughout the years on why the United States is so behind when it comes to making sure that the next generation is equipped to be productive within society. So, one question that I want to propose to you is in regards to public education. I know that the main thing that young people today in high school, in college, whatever sort of level you are inside of your academics, is memorization. And the moment that you memorize it and you pass the test and you get your degree, then it's gone. How do we shift from an attitude from memorization to application so we can actually be productive within our society and we're able to actually be innovative and we can be ahead and we can actually be that great country that we always pose to be?
Yeah, I mean, the way we approach education is often like so fixed and regimented, and I think it's really interesting because we oftentimes don't stop and realize that we're pretty like young in terms of our education system as a country, right? Like
Mhm,
education wasn't compulsory in all 50 states in the United States until 1918.
mhm,
Just to like put it in perspective for you, right? Like the notion of
Mhm.
education for everybody, right, is not even like a constitutional right. You know, we have
right.
the right to bear arms, but the right to like read is like not a thing. Yeah, like just like perspective. And early education, we're talking about like Ivy League institutions, your Harvards or Yales, whatever, right? Like early and on in Massachusetts. And the initial intention of them was to like teach people virtues and values and not necessarily how to think or critique, right? And that carried on. And then even when you get to things like grading, right? Like people get so caught up in grades and GPAs and all of that, right? But there's literally like in the 1970s there was a study and it said that like, hey, like some semblance of a grading system, right? Like any
Mhm.
means of like grading only exists in like a little over half of the schools in this country, right? Like approximately
Mhm,
60%. So like we didn't even have that wide scale. And grading really dates back again, early colleges, universities. Yale was really big in the process, so was Harvard, Mount Holyoke, like really old institutions in higher education. They're the ones who really started this whole kind of like grading phenomenon. And it was interesting because like the reason they created it was not external facing for students, but it was like internal facing so that the teachers could kind of like have a pulse on how folks are doing. They weren't requiring exams to confer degrees. They didn't have GPA requirements. And honestly, the proliferation of like grading structures as they exist now, as we know them, the 0 to 100, A through F type of situation, it really came about when you started having people coming from different parts of the country attempting to join colleges and universities because they needed a normed way to have a pulse on how good of a student they
Mhm.
were. Right. So it was like out of necessity. And the people that really started grading those institutions very quickly, like in the late 1800s or early 1900s, were like, yeah, no, we don't like this. Like teachers don't like it. We're going to move away from it. And now you see like those institutions are dropping it and leaving it alone. So,
mhm,
I mean, we operate as if education system in the United States of America is unchangeable. Like it's been around, since 1607 Jamestown, and like we can't change it, fix it, or adjust it. I mean, you'd be
Mhm.
surprised when I try to like, I like got to a point as an educator where I like stopped giving homework, right? And not because I was like, oh, let me
mhm,
stop giving homework. This is cute, but like it's actually like ineffective and can be destructive in a lot of different ways, right? The
mhm,
concept of like how we use grades and just like stop doing that. Like, and when you do that, it's really hard for educators to wrap their mind around it. So if we really want to get to a place where we're creating educational systems, that foundationally work for students, we have to really ground ourselves in what is the purpose of education. And the purpose of education is not to know a bunch of stuff. The purpose of education is to be able to step into new environments and situations
Mhm.
and be able to navigate them by leveraging a skill set that you got before you got to that point. We
mhm,
want people to be able to walk into other situations and like figure it out, right? And you know what I mean? That means the application of a bunch of different skills, almost as if like education fills you with a toolbox, right?
Mhm.
And teaches you how to discern which tool to use when and how. Right. So like if we
Yeah.
want to get to that place, we actually probably have to drop a lot of the conventional structures that were in place. Right. Like I learned multiplication by memorizing times tables. Like that doesn't work. I was good at memorization, so it worked out for me. So I didn't really question it. But for someone who
mhm,
like that's not how their brain processes, like that's not how it works. I have a really
Mhm.
close friend of mine. He, again, like black dude from Charlotte, right? But his father was working for a foreign company in Indonesia, and he was there up until he started middle school, right? Went on to study mathematics in college, right? Like summa cum laude, top student, study mathematics. Went on worked for Google, whatever. Like all of the pedigree. Never learned multiplication tables at all, ever.
Mhm.
They were taught multiplication as repeated addition, which is what multiplication functionally is. So the idea of
mhm,
like memorizing what the arbitrary product of two numbers you're multiplying, like just seemed like a weird thing to him. And if we think about it, it's pretty damn weird. Right? Like
Mhm.
we teach somebody
right.
how to do something by like having them memorize it and somehow they're supposed to like apply that to new context, maybe, right? Like that's not actually how people learn and grow. And I
Mhm,
think that the push for educators in a lot of ways is to just like pause and ask yourself what the intention is of what they're doing and what they're hoping to accomplish in the moment with that action. And if that actually doesn't equip a person not just with knowledge but a skill set to apply knowledge in differing landscapes and circumstances and environments and contexts, then it's not actually education.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like that goes back to like, what are the difficult questions we're repeatedly asking ourselves?
Mm-hmm. That,
Right.
yeah, especially with like new technology and computers and stuff. Like root memorization is even less important because you could just, if you know how to use a computer, you could find your answers. You know, you don't need to memorize negative b, what's the square root of negative b over blah blah blah, like
Yeah. I mean,
that's
yeah.
not it. Just yeah, standardized testing was just awful. I remember taking it in high school and just like it just didn't make sense, and teachers would complain about it all the time. um, they would say like, "Oh, I wish I could teach you this, but we need to get through all of this before we before the tests come in, and then after testing, I might go over this with you." And it was like the most interesting stuff. You'd have to wait until the end of the year to actually learn.
Yeah, I
And
Um,
had
by
like an
then get burned
interesting.
out.
Well, yeah, I mean, I stumbled upon this as a teacher because, like, I mean, again, right, like we do what we know, right? And what I knew was show somebody how to like solve this type of problems, right? Like, I was a math teacher, so the process of
Mm-hmm.
teaching math is like show someone how to solve these types of problems, like adding
mhm,
fractions. Here's how you do them, like step by step. They learn it, they practice it a whole bunch. They get packets where they do it 300 times, and then like boom, they've acquired the skill, and then you move on, right? This kind of like knowledge repetition, knowledge repetition, knowledge repetition. Give you the skill, repeat it. Give you the skill, repeat it, and then boom, you like internalize it that way. Repetition is a means of internalizing things, but it doesn't like last forever at that point, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's situational. You use it when you need it, and then again, your brain does not catalog and keep every bit of information because that wouldn't
mhm,
work. It'd be like, I don't know, if you had a computer that you had, since 1992 and you just kept adding files to it and then you're trying to like function with it today, like that's not a thing, right? Um our brain is meant to like pay attention to differences that happen in differences that exist, right? But again, like as a math teacher, I was like, what I know is this is how you teach it, so I would teach kids that. And you know what, I taught the mess out of those topics, right? Like
mhm,
in the most like easy to understand way, in the process and the algorithm and the steps, and we did this and we're going to do this with it, da, 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 and we're going to practice it this way and apply it in this context, all of that, right? So I remember this really hit me when I was like, teaching kids the Pythagorean theorem, which is like kind of a hard concept for kids to grapple because it's, named after a white dude who didn't actually create it, which is like real foreign to them. Um, I mean, let's just be honest, right? And
mhm.
I was like, do you think Pythagoras came up with that? Have you seen the pyramids in Egypt? Like, it's just illogical to think that like the concept of how like
Oh
we
man.
structured triangles like really started with like Pythagoras. Okay, no doubt. But they a squared plus b squared equals c squared, da, 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 hypotenuse. Like they do the whole thing, right? They like
Mm-hmm.
blew their assessment out of the water when I taught that unit. I get to the end of the year, we're like reviewing for final exams and state exams and all that stuff. And I'm like, here, I want y'all to work on this. Like y'all blew this out of the water. This is going to be like real quick review. And they were like struggling to do problems with the Pythagorean theorem. And I was like, what do you? I know you all know this. Like you know this.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, what are you talking about? We've never seen this before. And I'm like, no, 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 no. Like, you know this. Like, we've done it. You don't remember? And they're like, no. And I'm like, come on, Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared. And then they all are like, oh, that thing. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mm,
And then boom, they just like blow it out the water, right? But they needed me to tell them what it was that they had to do so they can go in their Rolodex of like things they had memorized and then apply it, right? Like they weren't looking at the situation and zooming out enough to say, what am I trying to accomplish here? Like I'm trying to find like an unknown length of something, and what do I know about what's happening? I know that I actually have a right angle, and then one of those, oh, that functionally makes it the hypotenuse. So therefore, let me understand this. What's the like? They weren't going through that process; they were executing an algorithm, right? And I think that's where we go wrong. Where I'm like, oh yeah, I did this all the way wrong, because you know
Mm-hmm.
what? If anytime for the rest of their life, somebody tells them, oh, you just need the Pythagorean theorem there, sure, they might remember how to do it, but I don't remember the last time I've needed to apply a principle where somebody told me what principle I needed to apply before I did it.
Mm-hmm.
Like people are like, oh, I don't know how to do math. I'm like, you solve equations all the time. Solving equations is about filling in the blanks. That's all that is. You
Mm-hmm.
do it
mhm,
all the time, right? Like, oh man, I'm not really good at math. I'm like, really? You can kind of predict how much stuff costs when you go to the grocery store fairly well, right? Like, don't tell me that your number sense is like not there. You just like don't realize that the things that you do commonly like has a name and a title. Like we're just formalizing the process of being able to exist as a person in the world, right? That's all education is.
mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Man, I wish you were my teacher back when I was learning math. No homework,
Man,
a teacher that
I know, no
actually
homework.
cares about teaching, like
Yeah, it's a process though, man. It's interesting. I'll like talk to kids that they're like grown now. They're like 24, 25, and they're like, remember
Uh-huh.
we was in seventh grade? And I just think about all the like mistakes that I made as an educator. I think that's the beauty of it. Um, anyone who's like, I was a beast as a teacher and I was perfect, like they're lying to you, right? Like that's not how that
Hmm.
works. That's like, someone who says that like, yeah, I was getting a lot of fights as a kid and I never lost. I'm like, oh, okay, all right.
Uh,
Like
well,
you never
Must have not
lost.
been a lot of fights.
Yeah, I'm like, what you mean is you're 1 for 1, right? On the one, like, situation you opted into. Like, so, like, it's true at a surface level, but any educator will talk about any good one at least, they'll talk about all the mistakes that they made and all the ways that they learn and all the ways that, like,
Mhm,
kids actually teach you how to be a better educator and by extension, a better you. And the
Hmm.
process of being an educator and standing in front of people is literally the process of submitting yourself to, you know, 30 to 40 some odd, God knows how many people who are literally holding up like little mirrors that give you every angle and every perspective on yourself, good, bad, or in between. Like if you think you're overwhelmed when you go to buy clothes and they have those like threefold mirrors, those trifolds, right? Like, and you're like, ooh, no. Like, think about what it's like to have 30 some odd different vantage points that you might not always be paying attention to. And it
Hmm.
airs you all the way out, all the way at your core. And you always have a decision that you have to make. Either you submit yourself to that level of self reflection and scrutiny and you become better as a result of it, or you run away and hide
Hmm.
and you just stay stagnant and arguably destructive. And like that is the same way that we approach this equity work, this anti-racism work. Our
Hmm.
job is to just help you hold up a mirror so you can just see it for what it is. And if and whether or not you're okay with the reflection that is looking back at you, that's the question that you need to ask yourself. And again, people a lot of times in that environment either cover their ears up or point the finger, right? That's this
mhm,
cognitive dissonance that's happening and that people have to make fun of it or to make sense of it. And honestly, I always people are a product of their socialization. We like to think that we everything that we believe is because we opted into believing that, like we made that conscious choice. And we don't realize that a lot of what we believe is just based on where we grew up, what family we were born into, part of the world, like what generation, all
Hmm.
of those things. Like they inform the things that we believe. So I don't really like, I can't fault you for being a product of your socialization because we all are. But I
Right.
can fault you with the actions that you take from the point of awareness. And I think that our work is about like, how do we generate the point of awareness? And from there, now you're called to task. Like, what it is at this point. What you're going to do about it is the only question that we have.
Right.
so the people that you teach mostly they're white, right? Like white teachers predominantly?
No, I don't think so. I mean, man, I wish I had like hard numbers. We definitely go in some environments that are predominantly, if not mostly white, but we definitely operate in environments that are, entirely black, entirely Latinx, entirely API, right? Like we operate
Interesting.
all over the country.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, it's a pretty substantial mix of folks, particularly in schools, right? Like since everyone decided that like equity and DEI and diversity and like and anti-racism is like the new cool sexy thing to do, we've definitely gotten a lot more outreach from folks who operate, more so in the tech space, finance space, private sector more broadly, and they will have predominantly white populations, but we have a pretty healthy mix thus
Hmm.
far.
Oh wow, yeah. Because when
Yeah.
I hear teaching anti-racism, you know, that's the first thing that comes to mind is teaching white people about anti-racism. So
Hmm.
Yeah,
it's interesting that you have a mix of people that you teach this to.
But I can see on the other side how that's valuable as well, because even if you did teach it to the Black community or the Latinx community or whatever community, um, if you think about the Black community, you have to sort of teach them
yep,
about their own history and their own faults and own shortcomings as well. Because if the Black community is uneducated while we're doing this movement or while we're trying to advocate for reform inside multiple facets inside of our society, then we'll fall short. So it's important that all communities are educated and all up to speed. So yeah, I can definitely see the value inside of that. That's really cool.
yeah. I
um
mean, Dr. Gloria Ladson Billings talks about this idea of, culture relevant pedagogy, right? And one of the foundational tenets is this notion of socio-political awareness. And
mhm,
I think that's a little bit like the area that we kind of operate in, where it's like, how do you build a person's socio-political awareness and the history, and really like, how do I make sense of why what I see in front of me today is that way? That information is not just hidden from white people; it's hidden from people of color as well. I think the
mhm,
foundational difference is that, you know, you can exist and function in the absence of that knowledge if you have privilege relative to that aspect of your identity,
Mhm.
you know? So it's like easier for white people to like not be aware of that and not have that lack of awareness, have a negative effect on them. People of color are, you know, can be gravely affected by operating in a space that like is literally systematically disadvantages them, um,
Mhm.
and to lack foundational understanding of why that's the case, right? Because then you think it's you. Can you
Mhm.
imagine if like every time, like all you ever see on the news and on the radio and the movies and media and your experience is that like people who look like you are, more likely to die or get arrested or be accused of something falsely or to be impoverished or to not have access to political, right? Like it's very easy, if we're being logical, to say, okay,
Mhm.
well, like there's something flawed about me as a person. Now,
Right.
Yeah.
if we learn the history as to why that's the case, then you can say, oh, it's not me, right? Like it's not about my acute actions. And that doesn't mean that like personal accountability and whatever is like not a part of it. But it is to say that if there is a disparity that exists along the lines of race, then it's a systemic issue, right?
Mhm.
People, black people, API folks, Latinx, indigenous, people of color, like commit crimes and do bad things at the same rate as white people. And if
Mhm.
the numbers don't show that, right, then we have a systemic issue.
Hmm.
They achieve at high levels at the same rate as white people. They, start businesses or like are inclined to start businesses and are, pioneering at the same rate as white people, right? Like there's nothing that's inherently different about those groups of people other than their access and the barriers that exist to that access. So like when we see those disparities, we have to understand that it's a systemic reality. And I think that's a lot of that work too. So the conversation can be very different when we're talking to people of color in particular. But a lot of times they're like, man, I didn't know that either. Right. And the other thing they add on is like, I feel embarrassed that I didn't know that. It was about me and my history,
Hmm.
my culture. And I'm always like, I mean, take that little lump and commit yourself to learning. But at the same time, you have to realize that you don't know because you just like opted to not know. You didn't know because you weren't given the opportunity to know. And if you did know, it's because you went out of your way to access information and knowledge and resources and understanding that wasn't or likely wasn't readily available to you. Like I'm trying to think like when was the last time that you formally had to take a class or course or learning on race that you
Mhm.
didn't opt into? And for most people, like, no, it wasn't like a thing. I'm like, yeah, it wasn't a thing. So like to say that you don't know about it is not like that surprising, right? Like if I just was like, hey, who here like speaks German, for example, and then the
Mhm.
people who are like, I took a German class will say that, and everyone else will be like, of course I don't speak German because I didn't take a German class. I didn't have to take a German class. I didn't like have access to a German class, and they wouldn't feel bad about it. But when people don't know about like socio-political structures that lead to systemic oppression along the lines of race, somehow there's like a level of guilt. Get it typically from
Mhm.
people of color. I definitely get it from white people too. They're like, I didn't know this about white people, and I'm like, yeah, I know.
Hmm.
Now ask like that's not the problem. The problem is, you know, the, is really grounded in the question of like why you didn't have the opportunity to know about it.
Mhm. And in addition to that, just expanding on that, I know that a lot of ideas and plans are being put into place, or at least trying to be formulated inside multiple states. On okay, if we do bring our children back to school, how do we keep them safe from COVID-19? Because that's like the main issue right now.
Right.
Whether it'll be a hybrid sort of deal when it comes to, oh, just go to school about 2 days a week rather than all five, or it'll be completely remote, or certain social distancing policies will be put into place. But another thing on the flip side that people are sort of advocating for is the revamping and sort of re-examining our curriculum inside of our public education system. um, and I know that a lot of concern goes into the history books in the history classes and what
Right.
we're teaching our youth today. So I wanted to ask you, in order to get more Black representation, or even expanding further, more people of color, the true history that actually happened, and actually not only exposing the horrible, horrible things that happened inside the past, but also the accomplishments that are buried beneath our history and never mentioned of when it comes to Black and Brown people. How do you think we should go about that?
Yeah, I mean that's like a meaty question. I think the short answer is like it has to be through policy, right? Like in curriculum by extension, like is policy. You'd have to think about this country foundationally. Education is held, or ownership of like what education looks like, is held by the states. So it would look like states revamping curriculum in order to make sure that
Mhm.
it communicates the exact same things that you mentioned, right? Like that it's an appropriate and accurate representation of history as it's played out. Like we can lie by omission, right? Like, and we can lie by literally, like, you have the miseducation and the diseducation that oftentimes happens. And I think it starts all the way at that top level. And I think what happens now is, because that is such a deep systemic change, we end up seeing it with like individual educators and individual classrooms, and that's like where the work starts, right? It's like a grassroots effort in order to get from point A to point B. I think it has to start with the policy, and you have to ask yourself how, like, that policy or the impacts of that policy, and I'm gonna pull a Reagan term that's problematic but it's applicable, trickles down into individual districts and individual schools and individual classrooms. It would like reshape the not just the curriculum on paper, but like the textbooks, and where do the textbooks come from and what's in those textbooks, right? And then how do you hold people like accountable to making sure that that's done, and how that's written in policy. So I think it starts at that level. And you know I mean, again, like we consider ourselves as amateur historians, right? Like, in part, I'm not in any like formal official capacity, but when we go to teach people about this, we don't like just theorize from a point of what we think. We try to connect it to what actually took place in history. And I think at the highest level, there needs to be a reckoning around what aspects of history we like don't know and don't understand, because in the absence of that, you're just going to get the same thing, or whatever change that takes place is going to be in small isolated pockets that take place in individual classrooms, which is great for those classrooms, but that's not how movements move forward.
Mm-hmm. And the structure of education in the United States itself is like it's a cycle of like detrimenting itself, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word, but you're
We'll take
better with words than I am. I don't think
We'll take it. No,
detrimenting
we'll
is
take
right.
it. We'll take it. We make up words every
But
day. I mean, it's not a way to write
right,
it.
so like correct me if I'm wrong. So schools here are funded by predominantly property taxes, right?
In most places, yeah, that's the case. In some
Right.
places, they don't. They like shift to different models, but property
Uh-huh.
taxes is definitely, if you want to paint a broad stroke, the most common way that we fund schools.
Yeah, so like in Los Angeles, right? There are students coming in from South Central going into because their property taxes is lower, so their schools are automatically getting less money, so they have less resources. So students are coming to more central LA to quote unquote better schools. However, I'd argue the Los Angeles Unified School District isn't great at all, but there are better schools. They come here, they have to take a 2 hour bus ride to get to school.
Right.
Uh, and so they have to wake up earlier than all the other students. Then at the end of school, they might be playing sports or have other after school activities. So then they get out of school at like 5, 6 p.m. and then another hour to 2 hour bus ride back home. And then only then are they able to like study for school and focus on their academics. And then they have to do the same thing all over again. So automatically they have a disadvantage, and getting into college or better college and all of that. So it's like,
Mhm.
and then you have the whole conversation with school choice, right? Charter schools, public schools, private schools. Um, so it's a whole like complicated mess, and it's from my perspective, it seems like a lot of these arguments between like charter schools and public schools are just repeating themselves. Like I did one of my final papers I wrote for education science was about public schools versus charter schools. And the conclusion I came to after reading a bunch of studies was that there were some public schools are really good, some public schools are really bad, some charter schools are really good, and some charter schools are really bad, and there's a bunch in the middle. So there's overall the success is the same, but there's this whole argument and tons of money being put into like the fight for which is better. In LA, like a couple of years ago, they just spent the most amount of money they ever spent on a school board election. That was like second to the governor election, and
Yeah.
it for the first time it flipped to charter school, like a pro charter school board.
Right.
But the from looking at studies, from a bunch of studies, overall it's they're pretty much the same, you know.
Yeah.
So
And
where, yeah,
go ahead. Go ahead.
I don't know. I was pretty much done. What?
No, I was going to say it presents an interesting argument because like we basically have started taking corporate, or privatization models and applied them to education more or less.
Mhm.
We did that with the medical industry, and we see the effects of it now, right? Like getting good healthcare is possible, but it's just like inaccessible for people who don't have, social political capital and just money, right? And wealth.
Mhm.
And we start seeing that happen with education. But again, like let's go all the way back in time. Compulsory education across all 50 states didn't happen until 1918, right? Education in this country has been this kind of like privatized, pay tuition, da, da, da. Like that's generally been how schools have operated for the longest time, and it determined who got access to an education and who didn't. So we're not like deviating wildly from the inception of education in this country. And I would argue that the education reform movements of the like 60s and 70s probably was like a stronger deviation because it moved in a much more positive direction, and we've kind of like reoriented back to the same nonsense and ridiculousness. But I think it really, your points just highlight the importance of like a policy based approach, because like where you have schools and who has access to them and how they're funded, those are the foundational decisions that have to be made. And I'm just going to touch on the charter thing because you brought up the topic. And you're right, like there's a broad range. There are really terrible ones and there are really good ones, and there are like private charters and there are public charters, and there's this whole gamut in between, right? All of that exists in that space. I think the fundamental way that we have to think about those, and honestly the way that they were pitched by and large, is they're almost like incubators for new ideas and approaches, right? Like
Mhm.
something can be like a school can be a charter school just if it has like its own charter separate from that of whatever the governing district is, right? They're like, these are the rules that are going to determine how our school runs, and that gets approved and accepted, and then boom, that's how they operate, right? They are now a charter school. They receive public funds, and a lot of places at the same per pupil head count rate as what the traditional community or district schools would be, and in some places, most places actually a little bit less, right? um, but they're like applying a new model. The way I always thought about it is like, oh yeah, no, this charter school is like, if it does its job really well, then it's incubated ideas and strategies and approaches, and like reintegrated them into the larger public school district so that it can serve everybody, and then they no longer need to exist, right? They were like a trial.
Mhm.
um, and again, when you find something that works, like you don't keep the trial running, right? Like to for the sake of posterity, you come up
Mhm.
with a new trial for like another way to approach things. So they should be grounded in this notion of innovation. And if they're not, we got to question like why they exist in the first place. So I mean, I always go back and forth. I'm like, am I pro charter? Am I anti charter? Like I always am going to be a person that believes that the schools that are immediately accessible down the street from where somebody lives should be high quality and should deliver.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
if we have a world in which there's a street like, or there's a school a few streets down that is like doing a better job, and one of them is not doing as well, then like that's a systemic issue that allows a
Mhm.
school on one block to be thriving and a school like down the road to not. And I think that's more the conversation that we need to have, and why that's the
Mhm.
case. And then let's be real, a lot of these large charter networks, are, right now have gotten to a point where they're very profitable for the people who run them.
Mhm.
And
Yep.
I think about how that connects to a capitalistic approach to doing that type of work, and the role of privatization and all that stuff. And I'm just waiting for like the IPO to launch for like a school network. Like we're
Mhm.
gonna be like, oh, all right, like this is the direction that we were going.
Mhm. Yeah, it comes right back to the conversation of equity.
And well, speaking of schools on a broad sense here in the United States, because when you look at other countries and other societies and how they run schools and education, I know that some countries they tailor the schools and what is taught in those schools after a certain point inside of your education. So they give you sort of the basic foundation of, the country's history, mathematics, English, what have you. And then afterwards, they'll sort of tailor to your interests on what career you're trying to pursue in the future, whether it's sort of like a trade school, or you're going in for hard academics, you're going in to be a doctor, but they do it early on around, I guess our equivalent would be high school. Do you think that would be possible here in the United States? And if so, would it be more beneficial for our students to have sort of that tailored approach based on what decision that they have?
Meaning like they're selecting tracks that they would want to like focus on, and kind of like what we do in like a university model. Like I've declared a major in this field, and therefore my classes are going to skew that way.
Exactly, but removing the GEs, the general requirements from university. just go right into, your major. Like, for example, I was a psychology major, with sort of an emphasis on neurochemistry. So instead of me taking, English 1A, or, the required English and math courses and electives that I had to take in college, I just went straight into, introduction to psychology.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note that like schools used to have that, like
Hmm.
people, I mean, even like for me as a kid, like people would be like, yeah, no, I would like to do like cosmetology and have that as a focus area that, my education is oriented towards. Right. Like that was a thing and it's a thing that we had. And a lot of people, are very vehemently are fighting for, reincorporating the notion of trade back into it. Right. Like we have to realize that the education system in this country was in its inception designed to do a couple of things. It was designed to track people in particular areas to determine who would get access to these, white collar corporate spaces, who would be like the worker bees, and then like boom, just maintaining that order and structure. And then we kind of pivoted to this like everybody got to go to college, right? And then we like inflated the college balloon, and then it became overpriced and inaccessible to people, and then you have all those disparities, and it's become this multi-billion-dollar industry for people to like get a degree and in exchange being, bound to crippling debt, right? Like that ended up being like an outcome of what took place. So I think like when you remove an individual's ability to choose what they want their future to be or how they want to spend their time or what their passions are, if you take that out of the equation of education, then you literally rob people of their agency and an agency that they're entitled to as human beings to like set a course and trajectory for their life. It's not that hard to do. Like we talk about these ideas like they're crazy impossible. Like we have specialized schools, we have specialized courses, we have specialized trajectories that exist all over the place, right? Like I just don't see what the actual barriers are to applying that to schools in particular.
Right. So, what do you think is the sort of that hesitation, or sort of the general public's sort of, well, should we do that? Will it work? How do we even approach that? And just going off of your earlier statement, you said that we used to do that. When exactly did we do that?
Yeah, I mean, we started seeing a lot of those. I mean, just think about like old movies that you would watch where like the kids are in like auto tech or like home ec. You know what I mean? Like even me, like
Mm,
my high school even like had literally like an auto tech thing, and it just doesn't exist anymore, right? Um, and like the notion of like vocational skills training like was a thing, right? And that's actually a part of the reason why a lot of schools didn't, compulsory education 1918 across all 50 states. It wasn't even through high school. It was like elementary school, right? Like we were talking up until like sixth grade
wow.
became compulsory. It wasn't even like you have to go all the way through high school. That even took more time until we got to that point. But that did leave room again for people who, like went to school seasonally. They're like, oh, this is the harvesting season, so like we're not in school because like we're doing that type of work, right? It was representative of what people needed in order to thrive based on the environment that existed at that point. And now we start seeing a lot of big organizations and big businesses who stop requiring college degrees, and we've spent so much time
Right.
and energy inflating this whole college thing. And now like if
Hmm.
somebody was like, yeah, I graduated college and now like I work at Google, it's seen as this big accomplishment. Guess what? You don't even need that college degree to work at Google anymore.
Right.
So I mean, again, like those realities were happening early on, 70s, 80s, and like those periods of time where we actually saw like a substantial increase in education and acquisition. Particularly, I mean, if you talk about like the numbers around Black people in graduation rates and literacy rates, right? Like we had a reality in which before integration, it was better, and then we started integrating, and then we started having more problems.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, I mean, I think it's really just like a testament to the notion of, like there is a barrier to doing things that seem radical. And a lot of times that barrier is fear, right? Like if it is a deviance or a change from what we're comfortable with, we shy away from doing it, and as if like discomfort is inherently a bad thing. Right? Like
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of worthwhile things that are very uncomfortable, right? Like when I go to the gym and have like a really good workout, like it's uncomfortable. I don't like it. Very easily,
Hmm.
I'll hire a personal trainer and be like, yeah, no, take me through this workout. It's good for me, blah, blah, blah. And I just hate the person through the process. I was like, you are terrible. You are like the devil incarnate sent here to like destroy my existence. Like you're actually trying to kill me. Like that's how I feel in the moment, right? But then, with hindsight being 2020, we see that that's a part of the process, that discomfort, right?
Mm-hmm.
We if you are like afraid of heights and that fear and all that stuff, like then roller coasters are really scary to you, right? And roller
Hmm.
coasters don't pretend to be comfortable. And
Mm-hmm.
there's this like concept of like aversion to avoid a thing that's uncomfortable, or aversion to avoid a thing that can like provoke fear. So
Mm-hmm.
there, like again, when you stop regimenting and defining paths rigidly for students, for people, and for institutions, then you're giving up a level of quote unquote control. And not having control is a scary concept for people. It's like teachers. I would have the hardest conversations with teachers. I was like, yeah, I don't know, let them figure it out, let them work in groups. And they're like, let them figure it out in groups? Like, that's crazy. And I'm like, why is that crazy?
Mm-hmm.
They're like, they're gonna go crazy. They're gonna like run around and they're not gonna do their work. And I'm like, why do you think that's okay? Well, like, try it and see what actual problems
Mm-hmm.
come out of it, and then try to solve those specific problems, instead of like by and large throwing out the entire strategy because you're afraid of the potential and unlikely set of consequences associated. So I mean, it just requires a level of like being brave and embracing the discomfort that comes along with trying new things, and not doing the same shit.
Right. And I feel like if we make that connection on and sort of just sort of not even ease the comfort, but also tell people to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, by going back inside of our history. And because I did not know that, that automotive classes were available and things like that. I think my like a relative of mine told me that, yeah, I used to have this and that, and I was able to be financially literate, which is something that is definitely not taught inside public education,
Yep.
and not even university as well. You sort of have to look for it almost, and even when you look for it, it's not available in all colleges, community colleges, or university level.
Correct.
um so I feel like that it is really good to make that connection of, hey, we've done this before. All we have to do is make sure that it's not only done the same way, but make sure that it's done better and that systemic racism doesn't come to fruition. And once we're able to sort of sample what we did before, revamp it, reinvent it, and offer this new form of education or this new form of doing things, then that way we can move forward. But going back on one of your statements when it comes to social integration and racial integration, I know that that is a term being thrown around, and really people are sort of adopting that and trying to educate them on that. But I remember I was actually listening to a talk by Angela Davis and Jane Elliott, and
Oh,
they
Jane.
said
Oh, Jane
that
Elliott.
yeah, awesome. It was an amazing talk. It was at the University of Austin, I believe. It's a few years old, but it's still a gold mine. So, but what a distinction that they made was, I can't remember who out of the two said so, but they said we have to stop focusing on social and racial integration. And to me, the way that I registered it is, yeah, they're right. We should stop on focusing on integration and look more into magnification, because when we look at different communities and things like that, we do not have enough representation expanding even outward from the history books or public education, but also role models, like black role models. Me being a young black man, um I can't think of any role models today that are constantly advertised or put inside mass media for the profession that I'm trying to pursue, which is in neuroscience.
Mm,
However, there's plenty of representation when it comes to the entertainment field, which, I'm not bashing the entertainment field. Like, if that's what you want to do, then go for it. I mean, I'm involved inside the entertainment field too. But when it comes to representation for young African American men, that expands further than just one facet or one area inside of our society, I feel like that's critical when we have those role models. But I don't see that enough. I see plenty of it after I dig inside history for a couple of hours and say, hey, an African American man made the first street light. Like,
right.
we didn't know that. That wasn't known to us. It wasn't advertised to us. So I guess my question to you is, in order to have more representation and even give that opportunity for people of color, what policies need to be put into place either on an education level or on a federal level?
Yeah, it's interesting because you talked about this idea of like integration, right? Like, and Angela Davis has another quote where she specifically talks about diversity as a corporate strategy, and you
Hmm.
can think about integration as like a social strategy, right? It's like, kind of like when you got beef with somebody, and the teacher just makes you guys sit next to each other, like as a result, or like hold hands or something like that, for like antiquating it a little bit. It's
Mhm,
like, oh, if you
mhm,
just put them in the same place, like everything will be fine. And we want a society that's like uh, structured in a way where people can go wherever they want to be and it's fine and there's no issue, and that is by definition, right, like an integrated society. um, but integration as a strategy has a lot of risks that are associated with it, because if you just like integrate an institution, an environment, whatever, without thinking about whether or not it structurally is a, safe and tolerable, and like a place that actually can, be functional for the people who are integrating it, then it can be a destructive practice. It's kind of like diversity. If you're thinking about like an organizational trajectory and moving towards anti-racism, diversity is one of the first things that people do, because diversity is all about just like the brownification of your institution. And there's a
Right.
word that we just made up, the brownification. So like when
We're
you
coining.
brownify your institution, yeah, no, thank you. Um, when you brownify your institution, like it looks cool on the, the pictures that you snap and, your diversity catalog and all that stuff. But what
Hmm.
we end up finding now is, you get this like Black at Google, right? Like Black at Twitter, and like where people can talk about what it's like to be within, a
Hmm.
minority
Hmm.
or marginalized group within this like dominant structure that's still operating in ways that are destructive to that group. So like just thinking that you're going to diversify and everything will be fine because now you have more perspectives, is problematic. So then the next phase that they go into is this idea of inclusion. So they're like, oh, all right, let's make it inclusive. These people with diverse perspectives are here. Let's give them the platform and the agency and the ability to speak to those perspectives. But, again, like that's where you get, they'll talk to the powers that be. The powers that be will kind of nod at them like, yeah, no, we hear you. Okay, great. So next week we're going to talk about this. And then it's like, wait, but what are we going to do about it? Like I just brought up a point.
Right.
So then they have to like be in positions of actual authority and power in order to shift the way that that institution functions. So I mean, the way that you get to that destination you're talking about is you literally have to look at what are the barriers that exist on a policy level that keep that from being a thing, right? Like why is there like a limited representation of like Black neuroscientists that you can look at, right? And it's probably one of a couple things. Either they're there and their narrative is being stifled and hidden, right, which is a thing,
Hmm.
right, or silencing that existence. So it's about one, elevate the narrative for some of those folks. Or on the flip side, the problem is not that they have a narrative that's being silenced or stifled, but that there are actual systemic barriers that limit people accessing that space, right?
Hmm.
It could be something as simple as like, oh no, like if somebody has, a degree from an HBCU, then like, we don't hire them or we look less at that, right? Or it could be something where you get like name discrimination that's taking place, or it could be something where like, we don't pay them, competitive wages, so they're likely going to be like, again, you have the what I call the black tax, right? Which is like when you're a part of a group that lacks generational wealth and you access the middle class, right? And you have some access to at least some proximate form of wealth, then there's this kind of like, it's not just my income, I'm like supporting the gap that existed as a result of generational wealth being absent from that group, right? So you're like helping out your family, you're doing those things, so then it limits your ability to build wealth, right? Like, so therefore if the company's like not paying me well, I'm going to go with the job that pays me better because that actually allows me to solve that problem a little bit more. um, so again, I think like we have to analyze like why that exists. There's nothing inherently different about, people who look like you in being
Hmm.
able to be successful or to, contribute to that space or that industry. So if we see a disparity based on race, then we know that it's a systemic issue. So if we're trying to understand that, we literally got to go with like, where's the gap and what are all the potential ways in which, that gap has been allowed to exist and function in this space? Because otherwise what
Right.
you do is you play into people's confirmation bias, right? Where they're like, oh, you know what I mean? Like Black people are just not into science, and then you like look in that industry, you're like, see, they're not there, confirmed, boom, my bias.
Hmm.
And we just don't look deeper than that.
Right. I definitely agree with that.
So we've been going for a little bit over an hour now. Do you want to take a? You still have time, right? We could take like a 5 minute break, maybe, if you want,
I,
or do we could just
yeah, I
hello?
actually have to wrap because I have to get to another thing. So I mean,
Oh
I
Okay.
no,
don't.
no worries. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's why we're just checking, so we don't go
Hmm.
Yeah,
over your time.
Hmm.
yeah. I mean, again, if you guys have any like final questions or new ones, happy to
Um,
field those.
I had one I was curious about. I was wondering what. So you travel around the U.S. a lot, teaching anti-racism. So what's been like the most surprising thing you've learned while teaching other people about anti-racism around the United States?
Um, Man, I think it's everyone just wants to be free.
Hmm.
That's all this is about. I think the interesting thing that I've learned is that people's understanding of like privilege and being in a privileged group and being in a target group is oftentimes heavily skewed to like their individual story and narrative, right? Like it's very easy for me to say things like, my name's Ahmed, I'm a black male, like I lack privilege, I'm oppressed, period, right? Like full stop, put the little title and label on myself, and boom, like there's nothing beyond that. um it is a lot more work for me to realize, yes, like through my racial identity, I do, lack privilege and I'm oppressed. Great. But I also have like male privilege and I'm like cisgendered. That's privilege. I'm heterosexual. That's privilege. I'm able bodied. That's privilege, right? Like I speak English and that's privilege. Like I like was able to attend college and I'm solidly middle class. Like that's privilege. And I think that there's this like barrier that we have around really being able to look at who we are in terms of all the individual aspects that make up the totality of who we are, and to really assess how those play into the conversation. And that's like the notion of intersectionality, which is Kimberly Crenshaw's work. Like black women have
Mm.
pioneered the work in this field for so long. um, but it's she like recently started tweeting, right? Like it's not additive, right? Like intersectionality is not additive, right? It creates a actually different reality. Navigating the world, like as a black male, is not about being black and male. It's about like the sum of what it means to be a black male, right? So it's not
Mhm.
like, oh, let
Mm-hmm.
me take all the privileges or lack thereof of being black. Let me take all the privileges or lack thereof of being a male and slam them together and I get the sum, right? Like that would be additive. It's not like that. It's like I need to think about like the nuanced experience of being a black male specifically, right?
Mhm.
And there are going to be areas in which I benefit and there are going to be areas in which I lose. So, I mean, I think the thing that I've learned is that that is a very, very important foundational misunderstanding, misorientation, or where oftentimes this work goes wrong. And a lot of times it shows up on the other end of the spectrum where, like, I'll be facilitating a workshop and doing this. And then, people will be like, well, what about poor white people? Right.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm
Mhm.
like, yeah, classism is a thing. Poverty is a thing. It affects a lot of people. Affects white people too, right? Like, but being poor and white doesn't mean that you also are like not white. You know what I mean? Or you don't benefit from
Yeah.
white privilege. And at the same time, being poor and white, you're not adding. It's not additive, the nature of those two aspects of your identity.
Mhm.
It's that it creates a fundamentally different experience with its own unique history as well. So I don't know. I think like that is like my biggest takeaway. I'm also always like really amazed that people really love to come and have debates with us on these topics, right? Like they'll just like run up on you and be like, "Well, I disagree with your definition of racism." I'm like, "Okay, well, let's talk about it," and then we'll talk about it. And
Mhm.
a lot of it's based on just like what they believe to be true. And I'm like,
Mhm.
I wasn't just giving you my opinion, right? Like I'm actually like presenting the research in this field, right? Like as a person who's like studied this research, and I'm like kind of telling you what it is a little bit, and
Right.
you're interpreting that as being like, oh well, that conflicts with what I said or what I believe, so therefore like we need to get to a level of understanding. And I think the big thing that I've learned is that like not all perspectives are valid, and we got to get out of this notion that like we need to honor and celebrate every single perspective that presents itself, because guess what, they're not all valid, and valid through the by definition in terms of like grounded in fact and truth. um, and I used to be like, oh, well, thank you for sharing that, right? And now I'm just like, oh yeah, tell me more. And then I would like have to zoom out a little bit and hold up a
Mm-hmm.
mirror and be like, I'd like
Mhm.
for you to point out that you have like admittedly are not done a lot of work in studying this topic. And like I have, right? By choice, whatever. It doesn't make me special. It just means that like I actually study this, homie. And you're
Mm-hmm.
meet with me about something that you are not particularly informed about, right? Like, where does that come from?
Mhm.
And then people are like, whoa. And I'm like, yeah, like it's really interesting, right? Like if I hire a plumber to come and fix my pipes and they come in and I'm like, huh, I wonder why they're doing it that way. I'm not like, oh well, you should do it like this. Like I
Mhm.
disagree with how you're fitting that pipe, right? Like they're gonna be like, oh, are you a plumber? Like, no, I'm not a plumber. And they'll be like, well, do you just want to do this? Or like, I'm confused why we're having a conversation
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
you don't actually know how to do. Like that's a little weird, right? um but there's this interesting reality that happens when you're talking about racial constructs, is that everybody has proximity to the experience of like interacting with race different ways, right? But like it's such a big topic of conversation that people have a lot of personal experiences, right? Regardless of what your racial identity is.
Right.
And when you have a lot of experiences, you feel emboldened to speak on your experiences. So like I get where that comes from, but a lot of times people aren't like, they don't realize that they're not you know speaking from the perspective of having actually like done that work and done that research. So I mean, I guess my big takeaway is people know a lot less than one might generally assume, or even that they think they do more broadly. Which is why we approach it from an education standpoint. I always think it's like funny, right? Like people will come up to me and I'm like, you literally just like thought to yourself with like the, you know, limited reading that you've done, that you were going to walk up to the like the anti-racism expert and just like tell them it's wrong. You're like, you
You
know,
got
like,
big smart
well,
coming.
professor, listen, I saw this tweet. Like, I think you got this wrong, right? Like, if you have a question, ask the question, but you have to realize, like, I don't know. It's like weird. Like, we wouldn't do that in any other arena. Like, I don't argue with my doctor when I go, you know, and I have a bit of a background in like health and science through that lens. So I like might ask questions, but that's what this person does, right? Like, and I'm here in this moment in order to like learn with them. And if there's something that I like disagree with or doesn't sit right with me, then my initial assumption shouldn't be that they're wrong and I'm right.
Right.
My initial assumption should be is that there's a piece to this that I'm probably missing. And if you make that assumption, then you position yourself to like learn and grow and potentially be challenged in your foundational beliefs and ideas. And you know, you welcome yourself into a world of discomfort, which is just, it is what it is, right? Like that's the nature of the beast. So
Mm. Wow. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Our Small Majority. Is there anything that you'd like to plug about overcoming racism or anything?
oh man, I don't have any pitches. No, I don't.
No?
But I mean,
Wow.
I think more, yeah, it's weird. You know, like I think
Well,
it's
no,
weird
I'm just thank you for
to pitch
joining us, you
anti-racist,
know?
like, hey, let me tell y'all about the
Right. I was
Well,
like, let me hear about it.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. Well, we're pretty new, so like, you know,
yeah,
having any guests come to onto the show and not want to pitch anything and just coming on the show just because they want to have a conversation is really amazing, you know?
Like,
oh no, I mean, listen, we're just here trying to do the work. I think more than anything, you know, we have a lot of people that just like want to learn more. So I mean, we have been a lot more intentional about, you know, putting out information, having people kind of engage with what we're doing. So
Hmm.
I think like if I had a pitch, it'd be like, you know, check us out on social media, follow the conversation that's going as it's unfolding, and you know, um, we welcome folks into that dialogue and that discussion as they move forward, in whatever
right.
way that looks for them. So I don't have like a. I always say that if we had like a business consultant, like they would hate us, right, and how we operate. We're like, yeah, no, nah, it's cool. Like we don't, you know, we'll have a conversation with you. May or may not lead to business, right? Like that's not what it's about, right? Like if the work is
Right.
getting done, we don't care who's doing it. At the end of the day, so if there are people out there who want to engage in this work, like we are a tool and a resource, one of many and multiple. So I definitely encourage people to explore and find those out, and you know,
Hmm.
follow those people on social media, and you know, engage in the work and do your research and study and ask questions and do all of that stuff. And that's the only way that this moves forward.
Right.
Yeah. We'll do it. We'll pitch for you for people to follow you
Yeah.
on social media on overcoming racism with no spaces on Instagram.
Definitely
So
appreciate
hope
that.
yeah, there's a lot of I've been like I know Matthew's been posting on there a lot, like a lot of great
Yeah.
videos. I think there is a video of you right in front of the Lincoln Memorial in DC giving a speech.
Yeah. Like that accidentally got sent to me. Yeah.
Uh,
I was like, wait. I mean, mind you, you like don't know when people are recording you. So sometimes people
Right.
are like, I got to
yeah.
record. And I'm like, really? But yeah, no, again, like to your point, we've tried to do a little bit more in terms of like putting content out there for people, because you know there's an information gap that exists in the space, and
Hmm.
I think that's a big part of the work that we try to do. If you make the assumption that people are, you know, good and kind and want like what's right for everybody, then when you don't see that, then there's likely a barrier that exists to that, and we feel that at least a portion of that is, you know, what people don't know.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
again, like we're teachers, so we teach.
Yeah. Maybe we'll add that. Maybe we could end the episode with your speech. What do you think about that?
Oh man,
Wh-
the rant.
If you're comfortable with it.
That's what
I liked it a lot.
I call I call it the rant.
The
The
rant?
rant.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah.
a little bit
We'll end this episode with the rant.
with the rant. There you go.
Okay.
All right. We talked about how this is a systemic reality, how this didn't happen on accident. It's ingrained in the fabric of our country because in 1607, rich landowning Europeans came to this land, declared it their own, despite the indigenous people they found there. They didn't have the labor force in order to create the economy they needed to. So in order to provide or to supplement or to allow for themselves to raise and grow tobacco and make money off of it, they brought with them servants. It was an insufficient population. Between 1607 and 1619, those servants were indentured European servants, often people who were not rich coming from Europe.
Irish, mostly Irish.
And what we find in 1619, when the first enslaved Africans were brought to this country, a reality took place. African enslaved individuals and European indentured servants, and really, if we want to define slavery, any type of obligatory labor is slavery. So indentured servitude was a form of slavery. They were European and African in nature. They lived in the same places. They did the same work. They dealt with the same circumstances. They married, they had children together, they developed communities together. And for the individuals in power, that is a dangerous, dangerous thing. Because what also they did is that they rebelled together. So you see in this country a series of laws that were designed to separate those two groups of people. The word white did not appear in any policy in this country until 1691. Policies started being written making it illegal to intermarry across races, to have children across races, all these things that we see woven into the fabric, and still it didn't stop shit. In 1705, this country did two things at the same time. We passed the Virginia Slave Code, which said indentured servitude isn't a thing if you're of African descent. No matter if you were free previously, you are now obligated to servitude for life. We created chattel slavery in 1705. It didn't happen before that. And in that same year, in 1705, we freed every European indentured servant, and we gave them a few things. Mind you, they were non-land owning. We gave them land. We gave them crops. We gave them money. And we gave all the men a weapon. We gave them a gun, a musket, and we made it compulsory in nature for them to serve as slave patrols in this country. That is the origin of the police in the United States of America. Formerly European indentured servants who had nothing, and when they found community and commonality with their enslaved African brethren, that community was shattered around this arbitrary line that is the color of their skin, because that's the easiest way to do it. And we convinced this group of people that they somehow were better than the people that they had sweated and been beaten and existed with. We created a class in between the two classes, never to be the rich land-owning Europeans, and still considered in their minds and in the social construct a step above people of African descent. That is continued in this country. 1776 was the Declaration of Independence, when we gave a big middle finger to Great Britain and we said, no more, we are our own country. 1787 is when we had the Constitution of the United States. We talked about all these great ideas we had for our country. We didn't name what those rights are, and we never named who a citizen was. It's absent in 1787. In 1790, there was the Naturalization Act of 1790, which said that a citizen is defined as a white person. And 1 year later, in 1791, that is when we introduced the Bill of Rights. It was not on accident that this took place. The first U.S. Census was also in 1790. So a few months apart from when we said a citizen must be a white person, we then proceeded to say, now we're going to count. And the census was not like now. People didn't opt into their race. They were told what they were. And a year later, we got the Bill of Rights in this country. This didn't happen on accident. And what history has shown us is the greatest threat to this country is people with common experiences. When the 99% bands together, the 1% has nothing and they stand no chance. So I don't want you to be fooled with what happened on 16th Street. Because I stood there today and I watched a parade. I didn't see a protest. I watched people joyously celebrating a mission that we have not yet accomplished. I stood 5 feet away from where nights before I saw chaos, where people were being abused by police, being shot with tear gas, sprayed in the face, hit with rubber bullets, attacked, beaten, and brutalized. And when the people didn't back down, when they became resilient, and when we responded more in masses, we see what we have now. Everybody steps back. No restriction, no law enforcement. Paint Black Lives Matter on the floor, put it on the building, feign the reality of success. Give the illusion that we have won. Convince people to back down, to go back into their homes, to leave the streets, and to stop disrupting. We got that because we disrupted, and I don't want you to be confused. Do not fall for the rope-a-dope and the misdirection. That is not what success looks like. And at the same time, performative allyship will get us nowhere. So our responsibility in our job is to continue pressing what we need to do and accomplish. There's no such thing as a peaceful protest. There is no such thing as a peaceful protest because peacefulness is defined as lacking disruption. And if you are protesting, you are disrupting the status quo. So inherently, us being here is not peaceful. And while we may not be aggressive, and we may not be violent, we may not wish no ill will or harm to anybody, let's not be confused and believe the rhetoric that says this is fucking peaceful, because it's not. And what we have learned is that when we unapologetically demand what is ours, the 99% is always stronger than the 1%. We built this country. We put the stones of that monument on our backs and we erected it to the sky. We made this monument to this individual who, when he passed the Emancipation Proclamation, didn't do shit to enforce it. Pulled the troops out of the South and ushered in Jim Crow. And at the same time, try to convince black leaders at that time that maybe they should just leave the country. What are y'all gonna do about this? They'll never accept you here. We erect and we tell these lies, which is why when the cries and the demands come for defunding the police, it's not just some random policy. It's literally so that we can remember when we look at officers and they brutalize us, we put the tear gas in their hands. We put the batons in their hands, we put the rubber bullets in their guns, not by our own choice and volition, but by the money that we put in their pockets. They are wearing our uniforms. We pay for this. They are using our supplies, they are using our materials, they are using our contributions, the blood and the sweat on the ground of this country against us, and we must not stand for it, and we must demand that they calm the fuck down and finally do their job and stand for the people and work for the people. Now, this is the last piece I'm gonna offer. When I have hired somebody and employed them to do a job for me and they don't do the job, I fire them. They are my employees. Public servants are our employees. I was an educator. I went into classrooms every day and I taught children. I did a very important job in my opinion, but I was never confused to think that I was not a servant of the public. I worked for the students. The actualization of their education determined whether or not I was successful at my job. My job wasn't about doing arbitrary things. It was about accomplishing things in service of them. So when they are not in service of us, we demand that something changes. So do not, in any capacity, be apologetic about demanding what is rightfully yours. That is why the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement have said that we no longer put our hands up and say, hands up, don't shoot, because we should never have to ask for the right to live. Putting our hands up is done with. Kneeling on the ground and submitting ourselves and our bodies to their will is done with. It is over.
That's right.
We don't say hands up, don't shoot. What we say is fist up, fight back. In the honor of the activists and organizers on the ground that have made that rallying cry, this is not something that I created or my own, but in honor of those people and what they do, that is what we do. So when I say fists up, say fight back. Fists up! Fight back! Fists up! Fight back! Fists up! Fight back! Fists up! Fight back! Do not ever for a single moment forget your power. And I will say this, I don't know how old y'all are, y'all are pretty damn young to me. Do what the next generation will be proud of. Think about years from now when you look back at 2020 and you assess your actions as an individual. Are you going to be proud of your opportunity to change and affect things? Or are you going to live a life of regret around what could have been, what should have been, and what reality you didn't commit yourself to serving a role in actualizing? That is your charge. When you leave, when you're here, think about the ways you can disrupt at all times. When you leave here, think of the ways that you can disrupt. Everyone has the opportunity and an avenue and a way to do that. Find that, do that, and fight the fuck on.
Hello, everyone, and thank you again for listening to Our Small Majority. In our next episode, we're going to look at public health, both here in the States and in South Africa. With the help of Christina Euban, a professor at the University of California, Irvine, we're going to see how political corruption changes the lives of both mothers and children.